So I want to turn just briefly to look at the discussion questions. Some of them we have covered in some depth. What are some problems with ethical systems that rely on divine commandments?
Well, the one that automatically comes to mind to me, if divine commandments is interpreted literally, that there's an external source of this, then one problem I have is I don't believe in those external sources.
Yeah, so
you
once,
do what you want.
well,
But
that's,
if it's taken in a more figurative way, that it's something that can be, you have this felt sense of there's a compulsion, an ought to do this kind of deed because it just feels right. It feels like a good, holy thing. And it feels as if
but that's
it's
not a divine
commandment.
That's not a divine commandment.
Yeah, but to me, the divine commandments are when it's a control. It's a way to control your society. So God said this, so you got to do it. So you can't question it. But in a way, what it does is it diminishes the human component. It makes it so that you cannot evolve and change culturally because God said you had to do it.
However, I will point out that any divine commandment requires some interpretation.
Fair enough.
Is
Which
war, murder.
Which puts the human factor back in.
What if you have a conflict of duties? So it says honor your parents, but what if your parents are immoral thieves? How do you honor them?
Yeah.
And actually what the rabbinic decision on that one is you don't turn them in, but you should encourage them to stop. So that's how you have to, because turning them in would dishonor them, but
Right.
Well,
Which
that just
works as
gives
long as
the
they
authority
comply.
to different people.
Hmm?
I mean, the authority doesn't go away, it just shifts to different people.
right, exactly. Also, sometimes you have an unclear meaning in the original. You know, what does it mean to covet your neighbor's house? How much longing after my neighbor's house counts as coveting? You know, maybe when I went into Chet's house one time, I looked around and I said, "Hey, this place is really nice," and I wanted to buy it because maybe I was coveting it all those years. But how long is coveting? So you have these variable standards sometimes that are hard to define. Also, keep in mind that some of the duties to God fit into those categories of sanctities and holiness and loyalty that we might not consider as high on the ethical scale as hurting other people. So there are people out there who would say, I would rather you catch AIDS than you use contraception, because your eternal soul is at stake if you use contraception, where it's just your physical body here. And so the Catholic Church's opposition to condoms, even in parts of Africa where AIDS is running rampant, they think it's being moral.
Right. Well, I think
it
because
follows
they would
divine
say that
commandments.
encourages that immoral behavior. If you have
No, it's not the sex, it's the killing the sperm.
Oh.
Every sperm is sacred, saying Monty Python.
Yeah, that reminds me of a Woody Allen movie too.
Yes, right. Anyway, so the point is that it's the very act of having sex, but not for procreation, that is the violation. Or people who refuse to let their kids get the HPV vaccine because they think it leads to immorality, and God's punishment for being sexually active is this disease.
You're messing with the natural moral order of the universe.
Right, exactly. So when your duties to God take over what we would consider ethical behavior, that gets problematic.
Yeah.
You don't have to be Abraham sacrificing your son on a mountain. I mean, there are other examples. Also, in many cases, these divine commandments impose their rules on everybody, whether you believe it or not. The people who are trying to define abortion as any fertilized egg have a definition of when life begins, and they're trying to impose it on everybody. They're not just living in their churches and saying, well, for us, we're going to do it this way. They're taking their divine commandments, and because it's God of the whole universe, it has to apply to everybody. And they're not just, living in their...
But we do a little of that too. And there's certain things that we see happening around the world, and we would say, this is bad. Like the women in some certain African countries who have clitorectomies imposed on them when they're like 9 years old or something, and we have a sense of indignation about it and say this is a terrible thing, and some people would say we should stop it. Child marriage is a good example.
Or sati in northern India.
Yeah.
And we feel so confident and righteous in our judgment about those things.
Well, we are.
Yeah, well, that's how I felt.
Well, yeah, I mean, and we can come up with sort of ethical criteria that supersede their religious practice. I mean, we do this in this country with parental treatment of children for medical issues. If they're Christian Scientists or other sects that don't believe in blood transfusions, the state will intervene and take the kids away to perform the medical procedure in violation of the parents' religious beliefs.
Well, I happen to agree with those, but I think you could make an argument that it's essentially the same kind of thing, where you're imposing, you're saying that I think my values are higher than this.
Right.
And so I think that this is bad. What you people do is bad.
Yeah.
And you should do it my
Yeah,
way.
we do that, and you know, in Texas, when they went and ICE tried to make girls have the babies, you know, in the camps, even when they wanted abortions, I mean, that's the same thing. I mean, it's either way.
Yeah. So, you know, we shouldn't be blasé about what we do in that respect, but we should also recognize that we're at least basing our arguments on issues of consequence and secular moral principles as opposed to what God told us to do or what a priest told us that God told us to do. That's a different standard. Also, keep in mind that if your approach to ethics is based on divine commandments, you're going to be relatively intolerant of anyone else's approach to ethics because you have the one truth, right? I have capital E ethics. I can't do it with one hand, but you have capital E ethics. No, like this, yeah. Capital E ethics, or capital T truth, and you know, I don't have to listen to what you think about ethics because I have the truth. Finally, I mentioned the example of following orders, but if you do believe in a God that offers cosmic reward and punishment for what you're doing, is that really ethical behavior? You know, if I don't steal because there's a police officer outside the store and I'm going to get arrested right away, do I get ethical points for not stealing? If you really believe that there's a cosmic God who knows if you've been sleeping, who knows if you're awake, who knows if you've been bad or good, who's making a list and checking it twice.
Well, isn't that how some people feel about doing something just because it's the rule? I mean, you don't really feel like you shouldn't do it, but you know, it's a rule, I should follow it.
Yeah, some people do it for that rule following, you know, loyalty, group authority system.
And they can't understand how you could be a good person if you don't believe that God's going to punish you. And that's your concern about atheists is there's no basis for morality because...
Unless you don't have a parent over you with a stick.
Right.
In fact, one atheist in a debate once said, "Are you telling me that the only thing stopping you from beating me up in the alley and stealing my wallet is because you think God is going to smite you? I'm afraid of you." I would much rather you had a different basis for your ethics.
Yes.
It's more reliable.
Yeah.
Actually, someone on Facebook recently posted a picture from a pool that said, "Lifeguard on duty," and someone wrote God. And I commented, "I prefer a much more interventionist lifeguard."
Hands on.
Yes. Okay, so if we do follow a consequentialist ethic, there are going to be some advantages to that, and there's also going to be some disadvantages to that system. So what might be some of the advantages and disadvantages to a consequentialist ethic?
Well, disadvantage might be, you know, you could do something like rob somebody, shoot them or whatever, and in the process, there's some side thing that is good that happens as a result that you had no awareness of or no intention of happening as a result of that. It just happened to occur as a result of your immoral behavior. Would you say then, because something good came of it, that then it's because we're going to judge morality based on what were the actual consequences? I would say you have to include intentions in there.
Right, you shoot someone and then their organs go to save 5 people, and
Right.
you know that wasn't your intent, but it could also be the case that we rationalize things all the time. So you might say, that person's rich and a jerk, so I'm going to rob them. And that's justice. You know, we can talk ourselves or convince ourselves of the justice
People
of...
do that all the time. I cheat,
Right.
I stole that tank of gas, but they're so rich it doesn't matter, you know.
Right, exactly. So you can rationalize almost anything to your benefit in terms of consequences, and sometimes there aren't clear rules of what to do. You know, it's not a thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder. It's a I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do or what the best. You can't always predict what the consequences are. You know, as Chet was saying, something bad might turn out good, something good might turn out bad. Your best intentions sometimes turn out very poorly. And there's no external authority that you imagine is witnessing the behavior. There's a reason why people behave better when they know they're on camera, right? They do. It's just empirically shown in study after study.
Works with speeding too.
Works with speeding, works with police officers wearing body cams.
Yeah.
The people are better and the police are better because they know they're being recorded, someone else is watching. So
what's an advantage of consequential?
Okay. Some advantages are the flexibility for new circumstances. If you decide that the practical consequences of AIDS spreading is worse than your theology of sperm, then you're willing to take that innovation. You might accept same-sex relationships in a way that previous generations would not have, because your culture has shifted into the, that's not an ick factor sanctity violation anymore. It's people making their own choice about living their lives in their own way, and you value the liberty side a little bit more. So you can be more flexible for those circumstances. Also, in theory, you minimize the focus on self-benefit. If you're thinking about consequences for other people, not just yourself, then you're going to, have what we would consider a broader moral orbit of who counts as us, as the in group. Not just me, not just my family, but a broader understanding of humanity if you think about it in a broader consequences for the greatest number style. It does emphasize human empowerment and autonomy. As the authoritarian rules were taking it away by saying you have to do this because God said so, if we have to make the ethical decisions ourselves, then ethics is a human creation. And it's a human collective creation that we've worked on together over many centuries. It's not like we're starting from scratch and inventing ethics from nothing. People have been doing this without the divine net for a long time. And one of the best arguments is what John Stuart Mill makes in his utilitarianism book, where he says that this is often how people make decisions anyways. And if you're deciding, do I want to do this or do I want to do that, you think about what's going to happen. And you make a decision based on, what's going to be the best approach. And if you have nice sympathies for others, you might make it more broadly. If you have it just for yourself, you might just make it for yourself. But you're still thinking about the consequences.
Like what's going to create the greatest good for the greatest number.
Right, or for me. But it's still consequences either way. And finally, there's a tangible motivation there. You can say, if I do this, here's what good will come out of it. Whether it's feeling better about myself or helping people who might help me, but there's something tangible there, not, God's keeping score on his book way up in the sky, and someday I might see the benefit of that after I die. That's more nebulous, but consequences in this life are valuable. So we talked a lot about the ethical statements from Maimonides or Hillel, and the distinct Jewish ethics from Jewish sources versus the human experience. We talked about that quite a bit. How are our ethics different from absolute individual autonomy? Well, as we said, we focus on the consequences for multiple people, not just us. And we have to balance our dignity and happiness with the dignity and happiness of other people, right?
But does anybody have absolute individual autonomy? I mean, individuality?
Not in any world that has concept of human rights,
Well, no,
or
not
basic
even Donald,
rights.
I mean, not even Donald Trump. I mean, nobody has that ability unless you're living on a desert island by yourself.
No man is an island, they say. Right?
Well, I mean, I just don't see. So I'm not sure I understand the question, because I don't see that the absolute individual autonomy actually exists, except in the minds of,
Philosophers, right?
Yeah.
Well, this is the problem, that people imagine that when Rousseau was writing about the state of nature, where there are individual human agents who come together and voluntarily surrender some of their freedom so that they get protections of their rights.
Right.
I mean, it's a nice theory to talk about the social contract, but it never happened.
Right.
Because no human being ever lived alone in the way that the philosophers imagined.
No,
They were raised in a family, they were raised in a community,
Right.
they were acculturated to certain norms that existed before they were around.
The Hobbesian state of nature is impossible. It
Right.
just doesn't make any
Yeah, but
sense.
it's not supposed to be real, it's just a model.
It is a model.
Yeah, it is, but
And
it's a rationalization to try to figure out why social contracts exist, I think.
I think also, and we'll talk more about politics in our next session, but I think that what's valuable to remember is that we want to emphasize the rights of other people too. We support the freedom of the individual to determine the course of their life. within the parameters of social obligations and social consequences of your actions. You know, people talk about free speech as if they get to say anything and nobody should get upset. That's not the point of free speech. I'm allowed to be free speech in response to your free speech and tell you how upset you made me and why it was so offensive. That I'm not violating your free speech by hearing you and then yelling at you. So it's a balancing act of individual rights with collective needs and getting along with each other and respecting other people's rights too. So there is a touch of libertarianism in there, in the sense of you get to make your own choices for your life and I don't know what's best for you. But you also have to consider me and what's good for my life and respect my rights in that way. And sometimes it is to our individual benefit to think about what's good for the group. It's called a pragmatic self-interest or an enlightened self-interest. And we have a broader perspective on what's good for us. Why do we talk about dignity? Well, we're not just needs. We're not just survival. We're not just animal pleasure. We're also a sense of self and a sense of dignity is a core part of that. Think about things like self-respect, courage, responsibility. Those all come from a sense of dignity, a sense that you value and you can make choices. After all, if God's running everything, what kind of responsibility do you have? If you're running your own life, then you can take responsibility. And the seventh question really bridges into our discussion about politics. You can think of examples of social issues where our ethics might take a role, like gay marriage. Right? Supposedly passing Congress finally today. That's a case where our values of self-determination, not following traditional authority just because it's there, allowing people the freedom to choose their own lives, accepting diversity and new understandings of family, all those coincide to support that particular issue. Separating religion and government. It's pragmatic for us because we're a minority, but it also has, we would say, a higher ethical value. Environmentalism or reproductive rights, maybe providing basic human needs like food, clothing, or shelter. You can talk about healthcare as a basic right or not. That's maybe up for debate. Equal rights for women, especially in the developing world. I mean, these are issues where we have a consensus, where our ethics would suggest that we need to act, and certainly in response to racism, anti-Semitism, again, self-pragmatic, but also extending that lesson to other people as well. Now, where does it stick in the personal decision category? Well, maybe some people do need to fail. Maybe there is a place for a limited safety net instead of an absolute safety net. Maybe your taxation policy, your drug policy is something that's up for debate, where you draw the line. Personal autonomy absolutely would say I can put anything I want in my body. You might say, well, maybe not heroin. We've shifted on cannabis, but maybe we still draw us the line somewhere. And there may be more than one perspective that's compatible with our movement's approach on some of those issues. It's not always going to be we all agree on everything. And I've often said, I would not want to be a leader of a group where everyone agreed with me all the time. It's called a cult. That's where I'm the authority, right? And you're just doing what I say. I prefer a group where people think for themselves and make up their minds, and sometimes we agree, and sometimes we don't. And we can both say, my Jewish values, my humanistic Jewish values say I should do this. And other people might make different choices. Some would say, as one example, my value of avoiding pain to any living thing encourages me to be a vegan. And for me, that's consistent with my humanistic and Jewish values of not causing pain to animals and repairing the world and being aware that animals do in fact feel pain, which in the Middle Ages they weren't convinced that animals did feel pain. And so if you've accepted those values and you apply it to become a vegan, then that's how you've applied. Where I'm not a vegan, I don't feel like I have to be a vegan. Do I reduce my meat consumption because of environmental effects? Yes. Do I drive an electric car? Yes. Do I have solar panels? Yes. I mean, I've taken steps in those directions, but I'm making my own choices for how far I want to apply that and to what issues it applies. That's where I think we need to leave space for people to make their own ethical choices. As Chet was saying, ethics is something you decide for yourself. It may make making a list of rules harder to do, but I think it also makes making the ethical choices more relevant and more flexible to new circumstances.
I would actually modify that a little. I'm not sure if I would say we decide our ethics. I would say we have a felt sense of ought, and then you can make certain deductions from those and inferences from those and arrive at choices that you can make and that are a consequence of felt propensities that you don't actually have a lot of choice about. You make choices later, but the actual felt sense of ought, I think, is just kind of there.
Well,
Some of it is learned.
Sure.
I mean, I would not want to restrict ethics to certainly personal decisions, because I mean, the whole idea of mitzvah is that we're doing things for other people within the community. Now, whether or not it's our community or it's communities in general, that's something that we grapple with, and I think we humanistic Jews have certainly moved beyond the idea that we only do this for Jewish people. We do it for our society and for people abroad as well, where we help out with Amnesty International or Doctors Without Borders or whatever it is, I think. But
don't you think we still believe that you should do things for people who are in your group, but the hope is that your group expands so it includes a larger and larger part of life?
yes,
So instead of your group
yes
just
and
being,
no.
ultra-Orthodox people just like you, or it could expand to all Jews, or it could expand to all Americans, or it could expand to all human beings, or it could expand to all life. Just how big is your circle?
I understand what you're saying, but it seems to me, I mean, and again, I may be wrong, but I think that we have already taken the step as secular humanistic Jews to beyond our own community. That's sort of a core value of the group that we belong to, as opposed to, say, Orthodox Jews or the Amish, who are only looking at doing things for their own specific.
Well, and I will point out that there are Orthodox Jews who do universal charity.
Oh, yeah, I'm not saying no, they don't.
These communities are not necessarily, with ghetto walls and pushing everybody out. But we'll talk more about this when we get to the politics question, because that really does define who is in the in group and who is in the out group and how we balance those two. But keep in mind that there are things that you are allowed to do for your family that you would not do for other people that are still, it doesn't make you an unethical person.
Yeah,
right?
That's true.
And if I were a coach of a soccer team and my kid were on the soccer team, I would have to treat the kid like the other kids. But there's going to be times where I'm thinking about my child differently, or I'm giving my child more attention, not on the soccer team context, but in other contexts that I would to just a random person. And if you extend that to extended family, if you extend it, you might do something for your cousin you wouldn't do for a stranger. So
that brings us back to nepotism, especially in politics.
Right, and also the in-group and the out-group. So, if you expand your family to all humanity, you can be inhuman to your family. I mean, think about the kids who would turn in their parents in the Soviet Union for anti-communist thought. They're feeling part of the broad group to the point of betraying their household.
Unless it's concentric circles and you have different degrees of loyalty depending on how small the circle is, but you can still feel a sense of identity with a larger group.
Yes, and at its worst case, you've got the mafia, right, where they're very good to the family, capital F, but they capital F everybody outside the family because it doesn't matter, they're the others. So it really is this balancing act of universalism, parochialism, family loyalty, group loyalty, historical loyalty. Ethics is a very complicated field. Again, doing it in an hour and a half is not really doing it justice. But the best part about ethical conversations is that we have them after the fact and before the fact. So we're not just doing this ethical reasoning before we make a choice. Sometimes we do it after we make a choice and before we make the next one. We think through these issues, so when push comes to shove and we have that moment, we might think, oh yeah, I remember I thought about that spelunking case and this is a parallel to it, and now I have to make this choice, and maybe I'll do it this way based on the discussion I had. So ethics is a practice, it's a discipline, it's a routine, it's a way of thinking and a way of living that you can build on. There's a Jewish tradition called Musar, which was the idea of ethical refinement, that you train yourself to be better at certain ethical practices. Now, some of what they called ethical included piety and ritual performance and things that we wouldn't call ethical. For them, those were mitzvot too, right? Those are commandments. We might highlight the interpersonal side or the compassion to the self side or other aspects of it, but that idea of ethical refinement is something you can train yourself to do and to be better at. That's a wonderful ideal and something we can work for.
And we're faced with new things that we have to make ethical decisions about. When I was raised, and I was raised as an ethical culturist, we never talked about gay people, or I never knew trans people even existed, and yet they clearly did, but we weren't confronted with those things. But later on in our lives, now we've been confronted with these issues, and we have to make ethical choices about where we fall on these sorts of issues. And so it constantly evolves, but I think that the choices that I've made about these things and the way I treat gay people is based on my earlier ethical ideas of how I treat people in general, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I think having conversations like this and hearing ideas from other people and just going through these sorts of things are really helpful, not because I think then we'll discover what the moral truths are, but because it's like exercising your moral muscle and getting you to helping you to be better at reflecting on things that you might not have thought about before. And it's good for, you're saying that you're going to have future things that you're going to have to deal with. Well, it's going to help you to be better at dealing with those things because you have a stronger muscle, I guess.
Right.
I hate to say I got a muscle to do my head.
All right, so next week we will talk about politics and how we get along together in groups, ideally. Sometimes not so well. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for or who not to vote for, but we'll explore the philosophical category of how you organize society.